Hey everybody, John from Bike Fit Advisor. So I've been getting a few questions about what I mean by a compromised bike fit. And I mentioned it a few times in the past, and it's pretty basic. Essentially what it refers to is the fact that we have a limited number of sizes for most bikes. Many times only as many as maybe 4 or 5 or 6 sizes for a given frame. And they're meant to fit people from maybe 5 feet tall up to 6 foot 3 inches tall. So when you have this wide range of heights and sizes of people, and you're trying to fit them all to just a handful of frames, invariably you're going to end up with people in between sizes. And everyone, it's kind of a different degree to which they're in between sizes. Now, most of the time, the compromises are pretty small. It's not a big deal. Bikes are reasonably adjustable. And so for most people, we can adjust the bike just fine. And it doesn't really have a huge impact on anything. There's actually even, in many cases, not even a moderate impact on anything. Bike still handles fine, it fits fine, it feels fine, the balance is good, etc. But there are, unfortunately, a lot of people out there that still have trouble because they've had to compromise even further. And this usually results in a pretty consistent pattern that you see. And these are the hallmarks of that pattern. The first thing is, so if we look at this is a stem. This is a 90 millimeter stem, which is the length of it. 90 millimeters is fairly common. On a road bike, often you'll see them come with 100 or 105 millimeter stems. And it also is either a -6 or it's a +6 degree stem, meaning it's going to raise the handlebars up a little bit. So 90 millimeters, there seems to be somewhat of a threshold there as far as how the bike handles. Usually bikes at around 90 millimeters, they're still okay. Handling and fit and everything seems to be adequate. It's when we go a lot shorter. This is a 60 millimeter stem. Just for reference, here's that 90 millimeter stem. So quite a big difference in length. But I do notice that even at 80 millimeters, 70 millimeters, there's still an effect. What we'll find is that for each of these little compromises, the opposite of it generally doesn't affect things as much. So what I mean by that is, going too short, like going under 90 millimeters, tends to have more effect than, say, going over 120 millimeters. So making it too long doesn't have quite the effect on the handling of the bike, it seems. The next hallmark does still have to do with the stem. And I mentioned this was +6 when run like this, whereas this one here is actually +17. So I find that stems around, again, this threshold, it's somewhere around 12 or 15 degrees usually, where it's not terrible, but above that, it starts to play a role and starts to have an impact on the handling of the bike a little bit. And 17 is not uncommon. You can see there's 20, there's 25, and there's even 30 degree rise stems. So that's the second aspect. So we have too short of a stem and too high rise of a stem. And again, incidentally, when the stem rise is really low, if you're running, say, a 17, if you're running it negative, it doesn't really have a huge effect on it going much lower, to a point, of course, but there seems to be less downside to being lower. And the last thing we'll talk about is the saddle position. The saddle position, the big compromise I often see is when the saddle is slid forward too much. Now, most people do this to shorten the reach of the bike, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So what does all this result from when we have these different compensations with the length and rise of the stem and the fore-aft position of the saddle? Well, generally it does affect the handling of the bike. Many times people will notice that the bike doesn't descend or corner as well when we have these sometimes more extreme postures, especially when we get into real high-rise stems or extremely, extremely short stems as well. In addition, having the saddle too far forward can affect all these things because it's affecting the weight distribution on the bike in ways that the bike probably wasn't designed for. Again, none of this is going to absolutely ruin a bike entirely. However, it's just not going to handle quite as well. And the other thing that can result from all this is that it can result, and this might sound repetitive, but it does result in actually a poor fit. So a lot of times people do these compensations in order to make the bike fit closer to the way they need it to. They need a higher handlebar position, so they go with a higher rise stem, or they need the bar a little closer, so they shorten the stem, or they slide the saddle forward, or a little bit of both. When we do go to extremes, this can this can have this strange effect where even when the contact points are physically for the person are pretty good, it can still result in a lot of bike fit issues, because again, it goes back to how our weight is distributed over the bike and how we're balancing that weight. The most common version of this that I see is when the saddle is too far forward. This is really easy to kind of understand, and I've done videos about this in the past, where that can often create a scenario where our hips get too far over our feet, and it creates a sort of imbalance at the pelvis, and it will kind of create a less stable pelvic posture. Okay, so what can we do about this? When people come in to me with these issues, or if you're having these, if this sort of reminds you of some of the aspects of your own bike, what I always recommend is kind of go back to the basics and make sure you're doing and assessing your bike fit in the right sequence. First, we want to make sure our feet are set up right. That's cleat position. I have videos about that. Then you work on the saddle height. After the saddle height, then you figure out where the fore-aft of the saddle needs to be. And only after you've done those three things do you then start to address the reach of the bike. And of course, that's a very basic way to do it, but that's generally the best sequencing. Because what's happened with a lot of people is, for instance, let's say that you take that person that does have their saddle slid forward. Most of the time they've done that to shorten the reach of the bike. And I understand that it's actually easy to do, because all you have to do is loosen the clamp bolt and slide that saddle forward. When the right fix may have been shortening the stem and keeping the hips back to shorten the reach. It's a little harder. Maybe it costs you, $50 or $80 for a stem, but in many situations that's the right fix. Now, if you're someone that has a lot of both, maybe you have a really short stem and you have the saddle jammed all the way forward. Some people even switch from a setback seat post to a zero setback and slam the saddle forward. And if that's a scenario for you, then there may not be a ton that you can do about this bike. But it does bring up the idea that, okay, we can look to the next bike. Now, most people won't need extreme adjustments, but don't be afraid to, look around, go through a couple of different look at many different manufacturers and try and find the one that has a geometry that's going to suit you better. And if you're unclear about how to do that, stay tuned. I will have a program coming up here that is actually geared towards exactly that. It is how to make sure that next bike is the correct size for you, and it's going to take you through in a step-by-step process. So I'll be releasing the first portions of that in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that one. So we can try and make sure, and do some homework to make sure that next bike works. But there is another option. Many people discount it, but it's actually something that is in reach for a lot of people, even though they might not know it. And that is to investigate for a very reasonably priced, and they're out there, custom bike. And it's probably going to be a bike made of steel. But in a lot of situations, actually, this is not a downgrade. The steel out there is actually really excellent these days. If you're wanting to spend $800 on a new bike, absolutely, this is not going to be the solution for you. But many people these days, it seems like it's more and more common to spend $3,000 to $5,000 on a bike, on a stock bike. It's actually fairly common. And there are manufacturers out there that do custom builds in that price range for complete bikes. And the benefit here is then if you do have some moderate or even extreme sort of needs, or perhaps like your compromises on all your other stock bikes, and you can't find a stock bike that's going to help you undo those compromises, then this might be something to look into. There's actually a lot of good manufacturers out there that make beautiful bikes, and it's something that I think people ought to consider more, because again, for a lot of times for pretty much the same price, they'll get something that absolutely fits. Now, most people aren't going to need to take this extreme step. All many of you will need to do is just to go out, get online and investigate the geometry of a bunch of different manufacturers and try and find the ones that are going to match your setup the best. So let me know what you think about this. If you've had a custom bike built maybe, or if you've got some of these compromises and you're not sure how to proceed, or if you've actually solved some of these problems already, put them down in the comments below. I'd love to hear about that. Stay tuned again for that new program that should be in the next few weeks. That's it for now, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next time.